Jake felt his transport shuttle shake violently, as alarms screamed all around him in the cockpit, and smoke filled the small space where he sat strapped into the pilot's seat. And he knew this was bad because the control panel showed red lights, everywhere telling him that multiple systems had failed after the ambush by those strange hostile ships that appeared from nowhere in deep space, and destroyed his entire diplomatic convoy in minutes, leaving only his small shuttle to escape. But now even that escape was ending as the shuttle plummeted toward an uncharted planet that glowed purple and silver below him through the cracked viewport, and he gripped the controls, trying desperately to angle the descent, so he might survive the crash landing that was coming whether he wanted it or not, because the engines were dead, and the hull was breaking apart around him as atmospheric friction turned the shuttle into a falling meteor. The impact came hard and violent as metal screamed and twisted, and Jake felt his body slam against the restraints even as the safety systems tried to protect him. And then everything went dark for several long moments, until consciousness slowly returned, bringing with it pain in his ribs and arms and head. But he was alive somehow against all odds, and he fumbled with the harness release, until it clicked open, letting him fall forward onto his hands and knees on what was now the side wall of the shuttle, because it had rolled during the crash and come to rest on its side in what looked like a forest of crystalline trees that glowed with soft inner light through the shattered viewport. Jake crawled through the wreckage, checking himself for serious injuries, and finding mostly bruises and cuts, nothing broken as far as he could tell, which was incredibly lucky given how violent the crash had been. And he grabbed his plasma rifle from its storage mount, along with a med kit and emergency supplies, before kicking open the emergency hatch and climbing out into the strangest forest he had ever seen in all his years of military service across dozens of worlds, because these trees were not wood or any organic material he recognized, but something like living crystal that pulsed with bioluminescence, and the sky above was not blue or black, but a deep violet color with two moons visible, even though it seemed to be daytime, and the air smelled sweet like flowers he could not name. He took 3 steps away from his crashed shuttle before he heard the screams, and they were definitely screams of terror and pain coming from somewhere deeper in the crystal forest, and Jake did not hesitate because his training as a military commander kicked in automatically, overriding any thoughts of caution or self-preservation, and he ran toward the sounds with his rifle raised and ready, checking corners. And as he moved through the alien terrain that crunched under his boots like walking on glass, and the screams grew louder, mixed now with sounds of combat, the clash of metal on metal and roars that did not sound human at all. Breaking through a cluster of crystal trees, Jake saw her for the first time, and his breath caught because she was the most alien yet beautiful being he had ever encountered, with silver hair that flowed down her back like liquid moonlight and pointed ears that marked her as definitely not human, and eyes that glowed with an inner silver light. And she wore armor that seemed made of light itself, all flowing curves and elegant design, nothing like the practical military gear Jake wore. And she was fighting for her life against 3 massive creatures that looked like nightmares given flesh, all black chitinous armor, and burning red eyes and claws that dripped with something dark and smoking. The woman moved with incredible grace and speed, her sword a blur of silver light as she struck at the monsters, but Jake could see she was tiring, overwhelmed by the 3 attackers working in coordination to corner her. And one of the creatures raised a weapon that crackled with dark purple energy, aimed directly at her back, while she was engaged with the other 2. And Jake did not think he just acted, raising his plasma rifle and firing 3 quick bursts that caught the creature in its center mass, burned through its armor, dropping it before it could fire its weapon at the woman. She spun at the sound of his plasma rifle, her silver eyes wide with shock, as she saw Jake, a human stranger appearing from nowhere in her forest. But she did not freeze or hesitate, instead nodding once in acknowledgement before turning back to face the remaining 2 creatures. And now Jake was beside her, firing his rifle in controlled bursts, while she danced between the monsters with her blade. And together, they made short work of the attackers, whose dark armor could not stand against the combination of her enchanted sword and his advanced human technology, and within minutes both creatures lay dead on the crystal forest floor smoking and dissolving into black mist that evaporated into the air. The woman lowered her sword and turned to face Jake fully, and he got his first good look at her delicate features that seemed carved from alabaster, her silver eyes studying him with equal parts curiosity and wariness. And when she spoke, her voice was melodious like wind chimes. But Jake understood the words, even though he had never heard this language before, which should have been impossible, but somehow was not. She said her name was Lyra, and she was a princess of House, and the creatures that attacked her were called servants of an ancient enemy called the Betrayer, and they should not be on her world this deep into protected territory, which meant something was very wrong and dangerous. And she asked Jake who he was, and where he came from, because she had never seen a being like him before with his strange armor and weapons that shot light and fire. Jake lowered his rifle as a gesture of peace, and introduced himself as Commander Jake from Earth, a planet far away, and he explained that his ship had been attacked in space, and he crashed here not knowing where here was exactly, and he had heard her screams, and came to help, because that is what soldiers do when someone needs help regardless of whether they are human or alien. And Lyra listened to his explanation with those luminous silver eyes never leaving his face, as if trying to determine whether he spoke truth or lies. Before either of them could say more, a shadow passed overhead, blocking out the violet sky, and Jake looked up to see something that made his military training falter for just a moment, because descending from the sky was a dragon, but not like the mythical creatures from Earth legends. This was something far more magnificent and real, with scales that shifted between silver and deep blue like the ocean at night, and eyes that held ancient intelligence and wisdom, and wings that seemed almost translucent in the strange light. And the dragon was enormous, easily the size of a military transport shuttle, and it landed beside Lyra with a grace that belied its massive size, making the crystal trees shake and the ground tremble. Lyra reached up and touched the dragon with obvious affection and relief, and she introduced the magnificent creature as her bonded companion, and Jake realized this was not just a pet or mount, but something deeper, a mental and spiritual connection between rider and dragon that went beyond anything humans had with their animals, and turned those ancient intelligent eyes on Jake, studying him the way Lyra had, as if measuring his worth and intentions, and Jake had the distinct feeling he was being judged by something far older and wiser than himself. Lyra spoke rapidly too, in a language that sounded like music, and Jake could not understand these words, but he saw concern and fear cross her delicate features as she explained something to her dragon companion. And then she turned back to Jake and told him they needed to leave immediately because more were coming, many more, and they had never attacked in such numbers before this deep into elven territory, and something was terribly wrong, and if Jake wanted to live, he needed to come with her now. Jake glanced back at his crashed shuttle, knowing it was beyond repair and contained nothing he absolutely needed besides what he already carried, and he looked at the dragon, who lowered one massive wing creating a ramp of sorts, and Lyra was already climbing onto the dragon back, gesturing urgently for Jake to follow, and he had flown combat and navigated asteroid fields and survived 3 military tours in hostile territory, but he had never ridden a dragon, and this seemed as good a time as any to start, because the alternative was staying here alone in an alien forest with hostile creatures approaching. He climbed up behind Lyra, settling onto broad back between 2 ridges of scales that seemed almost designed as a saddle, and the dragon scales were warm under his hands, not cold like he expected. And Lyra called back to him to hold on tight, and before Jake could ask what he should hold onto, launched into the air with powerful beats of those massive wings, and Jake grabbed onto the nearest scale ridge and held on for dear life as they shot upward into the violet sky. Flying on was nothing like flying in a shuttle or spacecraft, because there was no canopy protecting him from the wind that whipped past his face, and no engines providing steady thrust, just the raw power of wings beating in a rhythm that Jake could feel through his whole body. and below them the crystal forest fell away, revealing more of this alien world, and Jake saw rolling hills covered in flowers that glowed with bioluminescence and rivers that ran with water so clear it looked like liquid crystal. And in the distance, mountains that seemed to touch the sky, their peaks wreathed in clouds that sparkled with inner light. But Jake also saw what they were fleeing from, and it made his blood run cold, because emerging from the forest behind them was an army of thousands strong, moving with terrible purpose and coordination, all heading in the same direction. And at the center of that dark mass, something huge stirred, something that made even the monstrous look small by comparison. And Jake felt Lyra tense in front of him as she saw it too, and she leaned forward, urging to fly faster, and the dragon responded, pouring on speed until the wind screamed past them. Lyra called back over the wind, explaining that the betrayer had returned after 3,000 years of imprisonment, and she had brought an army that could destroy everything, and they needed to reach the capital city to warn her mother queen and prepare defenses before the army reached them. And Jake absorbed this information, filing it away in his tactical mind, already analyzing what he had seen of the enemy, force, their numbers, their organization, their direction of march. And he realized this was not just a raid or skirmish, this was an invasion, a full-scale war beginning right now. As they flew, Jake caught his first glimpse of, and it took his breath away, because the city seemed impossible, a metropolis built from crystalline towers that spiraled into the sky, connected by bridges that glowed with soft light, and gardens that floated in midair, defying gravity, and waterfalls that flowed upward instead of down. And everywhere he looked he saw elves moving through the city with otherworldly grace and beauty. And he realized he had crashed onto a world of magic and wonder, and ancient power, and he was about to be thrown into a war he did not understand, fighting beside people who were not human for reasons he had not fully grasped yet. But as descended toward the palace at the city center, and Jake saw guards mobilizing and civilians fleeing to shelters and magical barriers springing to life around the perimeter, he knew one thing with absolute certainty, and that was he had chosen the right side, because whatever else was true, Lyra and her people were defending their home against an invasion of monsters. And that was something Jake understood completely, because defending the innocent against aggressors was what he had spent his entire military career doing. And it did not matter that these people were aliens, or that this world was not Earth, because some things were universal, and the right to defend your home was one of them. Landed in a courtyard where armed guards immediately surrounded them, weapons drawn and pointed at Jake, because he was clearly an outsider, a stranger, a potential threat. But Lyra raised her hands and commanded them to stand down, and explained that Jake had saved her life and fought beside her against thee, and he was with them, not against them. And the guards lowered their weapons reluctantly, their ancient eyes studying Jake with suspicion and distrust, but they obeyed their princess. A guard captain approached and informed Lyra that Queen had been, and demanded to see both Lyra and her human companion immediately in the throne room, and Jake followed as they walked through palace corridors that seemed alive with shifting patterns of light and shadow, and portraits of ancient elven rulers whose eyes seemed to track their movement. And everywhere he felt the weight of magic, something his military sensors could detect, but his earth-trained mind struggled to fully comprehend, because magic was supposed to be fantasy, not reality, yet here it was as real as the plasma rifle on his back. The throne room made Jake stop and stare, because it was vast, with a ceiling that somehow showed the actual night sky, stars twinkling overhead, as if there was no roof at all. And at the far end, on a throne carved from what looked like a single massive diamond, sat the most stunning woman Jake had ever seen in his life. And he knew instantly this was Queen, because power radiated from her like heat from a star. Queen was ageless and eternal, with silver hair that flowed around her like a living river, and violet eyes that held the weight of centuries. And she wore a gown that seemed woven from starlight itself, and a crown of what appeared to be frozen moonbeams rested on her brow. And when she looked at Jake, he felt like she could see through him into his very soul, reading his memories and intentions as easily as reading a book. And it was both terrifying and mesmerizing at the same time. Princess Lyra knelt before her mother and Jake followed her lead, because even though he was a military commander from another world, he understood protocol and respect for authority, and Lyra spoke, quickly explaining the ambush by deep in protected territory, and how Jake had appeared from nowhere, and saved her life fighting beside her with strange weapons and courage. And now the betrayer had returned with an army thousands strong marching toward their borders. The court erupted in whispers and gasps at this news, because the betrayer had been sealed away 3,000 years ago, and her return meant the ancient protections had failed somehow. And if she brought an army, then war was coming, war on a scale not seen in. And the elven nobles and generals looked at each other with fear and uncertainty written on their immortal faces. Queen raised one elegant hand and silence fell instantly across the throne room, so complete that Jake could hear his own heartbeat, and she spoke with a voice like wind chimes in a storm, beautiful but dangerous and commanding. And she said she already knew about the army because scouts had reported their movements an hour ago. But what she did not know was how a human had come to be on their world, and she fixed those violet eyes on Jake and demanded an explanation. Jake stood and met her gaze directly, the way he would face any commanding officer, and he explained about the diplomatic mission that went wrong, about the ambush by unknown hostiles in deep space, about his shuttle crash in the crystal forest, and how he heard Lyra screaming and went to help, because that is what soldiers do, and he did not choose to come to this world. But now that he was here, he chose to stand with them against the invasion. Studied him for a long moment, and Jake felt her presence touch his mind like gentle fingers sifting through his memories and intentions. And he did not resist because he had nothing to hide, and he let her see his military service, his battles, his losses, his dedication to protecting innocent people regardless of who or what they were. And when she from his mind, her expression had shifted slightly from suspicion to something that might have been respect. The queen said that Jake had saved her daughter's life, and for that she had his gratitude, but gratitude did not answer the larger questions about why he appeared at this exact moment, when they needed tactical advantages against an enemy they barely understood after 3,000 years. And she wondered aloud if perhaps the betrayer had somehow brought Jake here intending to use him as a weapon, only for him to choose the wrong side. Jake had not considered that possibility, and it troubled him, but he said firmly that regardless of how he arrived here, his choice to help was genuine, and if expected him to be her weapon, then she made a serious error, because he would fight against monsters and tyrants, not for them. Rose from her throne and descended the steps toward Jake, and up close he could see she was even more beautiful and terrifying than from a distance, because her presence was overwhelming, like standing next to a star, barely contained in mortal form. And she walked around him, studying him from all angles, and Jake held himself at attention the way he had during countless military inspections. She said Jake was a warrior, trained and experienced, and she could see it in how he carried himself, and how his eyes constantly scanned the room for threats and exits. And she said that made him valuable but also dangerous, because warriors could change sides if offered the right incentives, and how could she trust an alien stranger who appeared from nowhere? Lyra stepped forward and spoke passionately, defending Jake, saying he had proven himself in combat without hesitation, and without knowing anything about their conflict. He simply saw someone in danger and helped, and that spoke to his character more than words ever could. Looked between her daughter and Jake, and something calculating passed across her face, and she said very well Jake would be allowed to fight with them, but he would be watched closely, and if he showed any sign of betrayal or deception, he would be dealt with swiftly and permanently. And Jake accepted these terms with a simple nod, because he understood her caution, and would do the same in her position. The queen ordered her war council to assemble immediately, because they needed to plan their defense against the army, and Jake was to attend, because if he truly wanted to help, then he would contribute his tactical knowledge to their strategy, and guards were assigned to escort Jake to quarters where he could clean up and rest briefly before the council meeting. As Jake walked through the palace corridors following the guards, he tried to process everything that had happened in the last few hours, because he had crashed on an alien world, saved an elf princess, met a dragon, and now was about to participate in a war council for a magical kingdom under siege. And none of his military training had prepared him for this situation. But he would adapt because that is what soldiers do. The quarters assigned to him were more luxurious than anything Jake had experienced even in high-level diplomatic postings, with a bed that seemed carved from crystal, but somehow soft as clouds, and windows that looked out over the glowing city, and a bathroom with water that flowed without visible pipes and somehow knew the perfect temperature. And he cleaned himself quickly and changed into fresh clothes from his emergency pack, feeling more human again. A guard came to collect him after what felt like only minutes and led him down into the palace depths to a war room, where a three-dimensional projection of the entire realm floated above a circular table, and around that table stood elven generals and dragon riders and mages whose power made the air shimmer, and at the head of the table stood Queen with Princess Lyra at her right hand. General, a veteran with silver armor and cold eyes, was speaking when Jake entered, and he paused to glare at the human intruder before continuing his report about the army, which numbered 40,000 strong and had established a forward base in the marshes, and herself had been sighted along with her personal guard, the who were legendary for their cruelty and power. Jake studied the magical map while listening to the reports, and he could see they were positioned well with good defensive terrain and clear lines of advance toward, and the elven forces, while formidable, were outnumbered, and the generals were proposing a defensive strategy to meet the enemy at Clearwater Plains, where their cavalry and dragon riders would have advantages. After several generals spoke, Jake cleared his throat, and all eyes turned to him, and general expression was hostile as he asked what a human outsider could possibly contribute to military discussions that involved traditions spanning 10,000 years. Queen's voice cut through the tension like a blade, and she said Jake had earned the right to speak, and she commanded him to continue. Jake pointed to the map and explained that while Clearwater Plains seemed like good ground for defense, it was also predictable, and if was truly as cunning as they claimed, she would expect that exact strategy and have prepared counters for it. General sneered and asked what Jake would suggest instead. Jake traced a different path on the map and proposed a feint, making think they were committing to the Plains battle, while a small elite strike force moved through the Whispering Canyon here and hit the supply lines and command structure from behind, forcing them to divide their forces. The generals exchanged uncertain glances because the strategy was unconventional and risky, but Jake explained that, in his military experience, fighting superior numbers required asymmetric tactics using mobility and surprise rather than direct confrontation, and the Whispering Canyon, while treacherous, would be unexpected, and that element of surprise could be decisive. Princess Lyra spoke up, supporting the plan and volunteering herself, and for the strike force, because she trusted Jake's tactical instincts and had seen them work in combat already. Queen studied the map silently for a long moment, and then asked who would lead this strike force if they approved the plan. Jake met her violet eyes and said with her permission he would lead it because he had extensive special operations experience and understood how to coordinate small unit tactics for maximum impact. The Queen asked if Jake understood he would be leading elven warriors who had centuries of combat experience and who might not take orders easily from an alien stranger. Jake said he understood, but good tactics were good tactics regardless of who proposed them, and soldiers who wanted to win would follow sound strategy over pride. Expression was unreadable as she looked between Jake and her daughter and the War Council, and finally she said they would implement the plan, but she would personally accompany the strike force along with Lyra, because if they were gambling on unconventional tactics, then they would commit their strongest assets. General protested loudly, saying the Queen could not risk herself on such a dangerous mission, but silenced him with a look that could freeze stars. And she said she was the most powerful mage in the realm and bonded to eldest of all dragons. And if they were striking at the enemy heart, they needed that power. Jake realized this was also a test, because wanted to observe him directly in combat to truly determine if he could be trusted and what he was capable of. The council continued for hours planning the details of both the main army movements and the strike force operation, and Jake contributed tactical insights about timing and coordination and contingency plans. And slowly even the skeptical generals began to nod and ask questions and treat his input seriously, because whatever else he was, Jake clearly understood warfare. When the council finally dismissed, Jake was exhausted, but his mind was racing with preparations and concerns, and he went back out to the palace courtyard where he could see the night sky with its two moons and strange constellations, and he tried to orient himself mentally to this new reality. Footsteps announced Lyra's arrival, and she came to stand beside him looking up at the same alien sky. She thanked him for supporting her in the council, and for the tactical plan that might save lives, and Jake said he was just doing what he was trained to do. Lyra said most warriors would not risk themselves for strangers in an alien conflict, but Jake had done so without hesitation, and that made him either very brave or very foolish, and she smiled to show she meant it kindly. Jake admitted he was probably a bit of both, but he also said he recognized evil when he saw it, and there were clearly evil, and sometimes the choice between right and wrong was simple even when the situation was complex. They stood in comfortable silence for a while, and then Lyra said something that made Jake turn to look at her, and she said her mother was intensely interested in him, and that was significant because had ruled for 2,000 years, and rarely showed genuine interest in anyone anymore, and Jake should be aware that catching the queen's attention was both a great honor and potentially very complicated. Before Jake could ask what she meant by that, a tremendous roar echoed across the city and dozens of dragons took flight, their scales glowing in the moonlight. And Lyra explained that forward scouts had engaged the enemy, and the war had truly begun. Jake watched the dragons soar away into battle, and he knew tomorrow the strike force would launch, and he would lead elven warriors into combat against an enemy he barely understood, using a dragon as transportation, and he had never felt more out of his depth in his entire military career. But he had made his choice when he saved Lyra in that crystal forest, and he would see it through to whatever end awaited, because that is what soldiers do when they choose a side and commit to a cause. The only question now was whether he would survive long enough to understand why fate or chance or enemy manipulation had brought him to this world at this exact moment. The strike force assembled at dawn in the palace courtyard, and Jake stood among 12 elite dragon riders who looked at him with varying degrees of skepticism and curiosity, because he was still the alien outsider, the human stranger who had somehow convinced their queen to attempt an unconventional and dangerous mission, and they wore armor that gleamed with enchantments and carried weapons that hummed with magical energy, while Jake had only his plasma rifle and tactical gear, and centuries less combat experience than the youngest among them. Princess Lyra arrived riding, whose scales shimmered blue and silver in the morning light, and beside them descended Queen On, and Jake had to catch his breath, because the queen dragon was massive, almost twice the size of any other dragon present, with scales of deep purple streaked with silver and eyes that held ancient wisdom and terrible power. And when settled onto the courtyard, stones the ground trembled, and the other dragons instinctively lowered their heads in respect to the eldest among them. Wore battle armor that seemed made of moonlight given solid form, and her silver hair was bound back in an intricate braid, and she carried a staff topped with a crystal that pulsed with inner light. And when she looked at Jake, her violet eyes held challenge and assessment, and something else he could not quite name. Jake gathered the strike force and briefed them on the mission parameters, explaining they would fly low through Whispering Canyon, maintaining silence, until reaching the command post, and their objectives were to eliminate enemy war mages and disrupt supply chains, and they would hit hard, then scatter and regroup at a predetermined extraction point. And he used simple, clear language the way he would brief any special operations team. The writers listened and asked tactical questions about timing and contingencies, and Jake answered each one drawing on his military experience. And slowly he saw their postures shift from skeptical to professional, because whatever else they thought of him, he clearly understood combat operations. One grizzled rider with scars across his face asked Jake how he planned to coordinate the attack without magical communication methods that elves used, and Jake pulled out a small device from his tactical pack and explained it was a short-range comm unit, and he distributed similar units to each rider, showing them how to use the earpieces, and suddenly they had instant voice communication across the entire strike force. The rider grinned and said perhaps humans had some useful tricks after all, called Jake aside and told him he would ride with her on because the eldest dragon was fastest and most powerful, and they would lead the initial assault, and Jake agreed, though he felt distinctly nervous about riding with the queen, because her presence was still overwhelming even after the war council. Climbing onto back was like scaling a mountain because the dragon was so massive, and when Jake settled behind he could feel the raw power radiating from both dragon and rider, and turned his great head to look at Jake with one eye larger than Jake's entire head. And he felt the dragon ancient intelligence studying him, weighing him, and apparently finding him acceptable because made a sound like approving thunder. Glanced back at Jake and told him to hold on tight because flew faster than any dragon alive, and she was not entirely joking. And then they launched into the air and Jake grabbed onto the scale ridges in front of him as the world dropped away with breathtaking speed. Flying on was completely different from riding behind Lyra on because this dragon moved with the confidence and power of something that had ruled the skis for, and each wing beat was like a thunderclap, and they climbed higher and faster than Jake thought possible, and below them the other dragons struggled to keep pace. The flight to Whispering Canyon took several hours, and Jake used the time to study the terrain below, memorizing landmarks and potential hazards, and working out contingency plans for different scenarios. And he was aware of sitting in front of him, her posture perfect, her attention split between guiding and monitoring the strike force through some magical sense Jake could not perceive. The canyon appeared ahead like a wound in the earth, all twisted rock formations, and shadow and strange lights flickering in its depths. And Jake activated his comm unit and ordered the formation to descend and maintain radio silence from here forward, using only hand signals he had taught them earlier. They flew low between canyon walls so narrow that dragon wings nearly scraped stone on both sides, and the wind howled, creating sounds like tortured voices. And Jake saw the elven riders tense, because this place was dangerous, even without enemies present. But they flew true, following lead and trusting Jake's navigational choices. After an hour of flying through the canyon, they emerged near the rear encampment, and Jake's tactical assessment had been correct, because the enemy had left this approach completely unguarded, confident the terrain would protect them. And below them Jake could see dozens of dark-robed mages gathered around crystalline pylons that pulsed with corrupt purple energy, and supply wagons guarded by warriors and command tents where enemy officers planned their war. Jake signaled the strike force to form up into attack wings, and he activated his comm, giving the countdown 3, 2, 1, and then they dove like falling stars. The dragons unleashed fire and lightning and raw magical energy that caught them completely by surprise, and Jake fired his plasma rifle, picking off mages as they scrambled to defend themselves. And the camp erupted into chaos, with enemies running in all directions and supplies exploding, and the crystalline pylons beginning to crack under sustained assault. Directed with precision, calling out targets and unleashing devastating spells that carved through enemy formations, and Jake provided tactical updates through the comm, keeping the strike force coordinated and preventing them from clustering into vulnerable groups, and together they methodically dismantled the enemy rear guard. But then darkness gathered at the center of the camp, coalescing into a figure, and Jake felt cold dread settle into his stomach, because he knew without being told that this was the betrayer. She was beautiful and terrible all at once, tall and elegant with features similar to, but twisted, somehow corrupted by whatever power she had embraced, and her eyes were solid black like pits into nothing, and her smile promised pain and death, and when she raised her hands dark energy crackled around her fingers. Spoke, and her voice carried across the battlefield, cutting through the sounds of combat, and she addressed, calling her sister, and saying how predictable she was, and how touching that she brought her new pet human to play, and Jake felt anger surge at being called a pet, but he kept his tactical focus. Commanded Jake to get the riders clear, and she positioned between and the strike force, and told Jake this fight would be between sisters and he should extract the team now. Jake refused, saying he had never abandoned a commanding officer in combat, and he was not starting now regardless of how powerful the enemy was. Started to argue but laughed and unleashed a blast of dark energy that forced both of them to act, and what followed was the most terrifying display of magical power Jake had ever witnessed. The two sisters fought with spells that bent reality itself and tore holes in space, and made the air scream, and battled alongside breathing fire that burned with stellar heat, while summoned creatures from the void to counter them, and the ground shook, and the sky darkened, and Jake had to shield his eyes from the brightness of their clash. But Jake was still a tactical thinker, still analyzing the battle, even as reality warped around him, and he noticed something important, and he activated his calm and called to Lyra, telling her the crystalline pylons scattered around the camp were channeling power to each spell she cast drew energy from them. Lyra understood immediately, and she called the other riders to focus on destroying the pylons instead of engaging enemy forces directly. While kept occupied and distracted, the strike force systematically demolished each pylon, and with every one destroyed, Jake could see power visibly weaken, her spells becoming less devastating, her movements less confident. Realized what was happening, and her expression shifted from amused confidence to genuine rage, and she screamed at calling her a cheater and a coward for using human tricks instead of fighting with honor. Replied coldly that honor meant nothing when fighting someone who had betrayed everyone she claimed to love, and had forfeited any right to complain about tactical disadvantages. The last pylon shattered and staggered, her black eyes wide with something that might have been fear, and she raised her hands and opened a portal of swirling darkness, and she told this was not over, and next time her human pet would not save her, and then she vanished through the portal, taking her remaining forces with her. The strike force had won a significant victory, but Jake knew immediately this was too easy, because had retreated too quickly, too cleanly, as if the entire engagement had been planned, and he voiced this concern as the team regrouped. Agreed, and she said never did anything without multiple layers of strategy, and this battle had served some purpose beyond the obvious, and Jake realized they had just revealed their tactics and capabilities and coordination to an enemy who was now studying everything they had done. But there was no time to dwell on that, because the mission was complete, and they needed to extract before reinforcements arrived, and the strike force launched back into the air, heading toward their rendezvous point. As they flew, turned her head slightly and spoke to Jake over the wind, and she said he had seen what others missed about the pylons, and his tactical awareness had saved the mission and possibly her life, and that made it twice now that humans from Earth had proven valuable to House. Jake replied he was just doing his job, but shook her head and said it was more than that, because he had seen patterns trained warriors missed and made connections experienced mages overlooked, and perhaps fate had indeed brought him to their world for a reason. There was something in her tone that made Jake intensely aware of how close they were sitting on back, and how her silver hair occasionally brushed against him in the wind, and how her presence felt less overwhelming now and more simply present, and he realized with surprise that he was becoming comfortable around the ancient, immortal queen. They landed back at the celebrations because word of the strike force success had preceded them, and the main army was mobilizing with renewed confidence, and the tactical situation had shifted in their favor, and General met them in the courtyard, and for the first time looked at Jake with something like respect instead of suspicion. But Jake noticed was quiet and thoughtful as she dismounted from, and when she looked at him, there was something complex in her expression, something that might have been the beginning of trust, or perhaps the beginning of something more complicated. Lyra caught Jake's attention as the celebration continued, and she pulled him aside and said quietly that her mother had not fought alongside someone as an equal in centuries, because most warriors either followed orders or died trying to lead, and Jake had somehow done neither. He had contributed without commanding and supported without submitting, and that was significant. Jake asked what Lyra meant, and she smiled mysteriously and said he would figure it out eventually, but he should be aware that earning queen respect was rare and valuable and also potentially dangerous, because she was complex and powerful and had lived too long to be simple about anything. That night Jake stood in the palace war room alone studying maps and intelligence reports, because he could not shake the feeling that retreat had been too calculated, and he was trying to determine what her real objective had been when he heard footsteps and turned to find entering the room. She dismissed the guards with a gesture, and the doors closed, leaving them alone together in the quiet room lit only by the soft glow of magical maps. Said she had been thinking about Jake's observation that gave up too easily, and she agreed something larger was at play, and she believed true goal had been to study Jake, to understand what a human with advanced technology could do when integrated with elven magic and dragon power, because Jake was an unknown variable in a conflict had been planning for 3,000 years. Jake felt cold realization wash over him, and he asked if thought had somehow caused his ship to crash here to bring him into this conflict. Said she suspected exactly that because the timing was too convenient, and the void reached into many realities and dimensions and perhaps had reached into Jake reality, intending to bring a weapon only for that weapon to choose the wrong side. Jake processed this and said if that was true then had made a critical error in judgment, because he would never fight for monsters regardless of how or why he arrived. Smiled and said that was precisely why she was beginning to trust him, because someone who could be manipulated or bought would have shown signs by now. But Jake had proven consistent and honorable, and she found that refreshing after 2,000 years of political maneuvering and uncertain loyalties. There was a long moment of silence, and Jake became aware they were standing very close and was looking at him with an expression he had not seen before, something vulnerable beneath her usual mask of authority. She said Jake reminded her that the world still held surprises, and that was a rare feeling for someone who had lived as long as she had. Victory celebrations filled streets, but Jake found no peace in them because his tactical mind kept analyzing the strike mission, and every analysis led to the same conclusion that retreat had been too controlled, too deliberate, and she was planning something bigger than anyone realized. And the thought kept him awake studying intelligence reports in the palace war room long after most others had gone to sleep or celebrate. Queen entered the war room alone, dismissing guards with a casual gesture that spoke to her absolute authority, and the doors closed, leaving them in privacy, lit only by magical map projections that cast dancing shadows across the crystalline walls. And she moved to stand beside Jake close enough that he could smell something impossible like moonflowers and starlight, and she asked why he was not celebrating with the others. Jake replied honestly that he could not celebrate when the war was not won and had given up too easily at the supply base, and he believed she had wanted them to succeed there for some reason, and that troubled him deeply. Said she had been thinking the same thing, and her sister never did anything without multiple layers of strategy spanning years or even decades, and Jake's appearance on their world at this exact moment was too convenient to be coincidence, and she believed had somehow caused his ship to be attacked and forced down here. Jake felt his stomach tighten as he asked if thought he was meant to be weaponed somehow. Touched the magical map and projections bloomed around her elegant fingers, showing different scenarios and possibilities, and she explained the void was vast and hungry, and reached into many realities and perhaps had extended her power into Jake dimension, bringing him here to serve her purposes only for him to choose the opposite side instead. Jake tried to process this revelation that his presence here might not be accident but enemy manipulation, and he asked why was telling him this privately instead of bringing it before the War Council. The Queen turned to face him fully, and Jake saw something in her expression he had not seen before, which was vulnerability carefully controlled but definitely present. And she said she needed to know if she could trust him, not as a queen trusts a soldier, but as someone who had lived too long and seen too much trusts another person who might understand what that meant. Jake admitted he did not understand what she meant, smiled sadly, and said Lyra thought Jake reminded her of her late husband Aldrin, but that was wrong because Aldrin had been born to this world and understood magic and tradition and the weight of immortality naturally. But Jake did not, and that made him dangerous in a different way, because he was free from the assumptions and limitations that bound everyone else in her kingdom, and he saw solutions others dismissed simply because they had always done things certain ways. She moved closer and Jake breath caught, because this was not just a queen speaking to a subordinate, this was something else entirely, something personal. Continued saying she was 2,000 years old and had ruled through 3 apocalypses and loved and lost more times than Jake could imagine, and she had become stone out of necessity distant, because caring hurt too much when everyone she loved eventually turned to dust, while she remained unchanged and eternal. But Jake had appeared and crashed into her world, and saved her daughter and fought with honor and seen through her sister's schemes, and made feel something she had not felt in centuries, which was curiosity about another person and genuine interest in their thoughts and presence. And did Jake understand how rare that was for someone who had lived as long as she had? Jake swallowed hard and said carefully that he was honored truly, but he was also in way over his head because he was just a soldier from another world probably doomed to die in this war, and she was an immortal queen, and whatever this was between them, it was incredibly complicated. Reached up and her fingers ghosted along his jaw, and she said everything worth having was complicated, and she was not asking for promises or commitments, she was simply acknowledging what existed between them, and Jake felt it too. He could not deny it. Jake could not deny it because, from the moment he entered her throne room, there had been something magnetic and impossible and dangerous between them. Before either could speak, further alarms shattered the intimate moment, and Lyra burst through the doors, her face pale with urgency. And she said army was moving, but not toward. They were heading toward the crystal sanctuary, where unbonded young dragons slept in their formation chrysalises. Expression transformed instantly back to iron control and command authority, and she said if reached the sanctuary and corrupted those young dragons, she could bond them to riders and create an army of dark dragons. Jake finished the tactical assessment, grimly saying they would face dragon riders who felt no mercy or honor, only hunger for destruction, and the war would be lost. Lyra said the main army could not reach the sanctuary in time, but a small force flying at maximum speed might barely make it, and she looked between her mother and Jake. Was already moving toward the door, calling for the strike force to assemble immediately, but Lyra stopped her and explained the sanctuary defenses were designed to keep attackers out, even friendly forces, and only those with sanctuary blessing could enter freely, which meant royal bloodline, or those they granted blessing to through a bonding ritual. Jake asked warily what kind of ritual, because magical rituals on alien worlds could mean almost anything. And Lyra exchanged meaningful glances, and the Queen explained it was a magical link that would connect their life forces, temporarily allowing Jake to pass the wards, but it would also mean they would share strength and pain and emotions completely with no barriers or secrets. Jake asked how temporary. Said until the ritual was reversed, which could be hours or possibly days depending on circumstances, and she explained the bond was invasive and intimate, and Jake would feel everything she felt, and she would feel everything he felt, and there would be no privacy, no shields, no hiding anything. Jake understood immediately why she was hesitating, because that earlier moment between them, those complicated feelings, the attraction and curiosity, would all be exposed through such a bond laid bare for both of them to experience. He said to do it because if the bonding ritual saved those young dragons and gave them better chances of success, then personal discomfort did not matter. Studied him for a long moment, her violet eyes searching his face for doubt or hesitation, and finding only determination, and she nodded and told Lyra to prepare the strike force while she and Jake completed the ritual. When they were alone again, drew a dagger of pure crystal that glowed with inner light, and she extended her hand palm upward and commanded Jake to give her his hand. Jake placed his hand in hers, and she drew the crystal blade across her palm, creating a line of silver blood that glowed like starlight. And then she drew the blade across his palm, and his blood looked dark red against hers, and she pressed their bleeding hands together palm to palm. Ancient words flowed from lips in a language that made the air vibrate, and Jake felt power surge through him, vast and ancient and overwhelming, like being connected to an ocean of magic that stretched back thousands of years, and with the power came emotions. Fear for Lyra's safety and fury at betrayal and loneliness that spanned centuries of ruling alone, and beneath it all, warming the ice that had encased her heart for so long, was fascination and attraction, and the dangerous beginning of something that could become much more if allowed to grow. Gasped, feeling Jake emotions in return, and he could not hide them because the bond made hiding impossible, and she felt his determination and tactical mind constantly analyzing threats, and his homesickness for Earth that he might never see again, and his own growing feelings for her, complicated and impossible but undeniably real and genuine. She whispered that she had not expected this level of intensity in the bond. Jake said neither had he, but their hands remained clasped with blood mingling and magic binding them together. Said quietly, this changed things between them. Jake agreed, but said the mission had to come first regardless of personal complications. She smiled, and it was genuine warmth breaking through of careful control, and she said Jake was remarkable, and he should try not to die in the next few hours, because she found she would regret it more than she should. Jake replied he would do his best, and he used her name instead of her title, and she squeezed his hand before releasing it. The flight to Crystal Sanctuary was desperate because they could see dark clouds on the horizon marking where forces were already approaching, and Jake rode with on this time. And through the bond he could feel not just her emotions, but also the dragon immense power and ancient awareness, and it was overwhelming and humbling. The strike force consisted of the same elite riders from before plus additional volunteers, because the stakes were higher now, and everyone understood if the young dragons were corrupted, the war would be lost before it truly began. They arrived to find forces had already breached the outer sanctuary barriers, and dark magic was spreading through the crystalline caves, where hundreds of young dragons slept in glowing chrysalises waiting to hatch and bond with worthy riders, and the corruption spread like black veins through the crystal, turning pure light into sickly purple darkness. Lyra cried out in horror, saying they were too late. But Jake said no, his tactical mind racing through options, and through the bond he felt magical awareness, the way she perceived energy flows and power sources, and an idea formed combining his human analytical thinking with her magical perception. He pointed to a massive void crystal had planted at the sanctuary heart, pulsing with corrupt energy, and he said the corruption was spreading from that central source, and if they destroyed it, the spread would stop. said the crystal was shielded with wards that would take hours to break through layer by layer. Jake said not if they combined their strength through the bond, using her magic, channeled through his tactical focus together as one. Understanding blazed in eyes, but she said attempting that could kill them both, because the magical backlash would be enormous. Jake asked if she had a better option, and she laughed a sound like silver bells, surprised and delighted. And she said when this was over she would explain to him why he was dangerous for entirely the wrong reasons. They landed near the void crystal and Jake placed his hand over as she began channeling power. And through the bond he felt her magic like a raging storm, barely contained oceans of power, accumulated over 2,000 years. But Jake brought something she did not have, which was human ingenuity, and the ability to see technology and magic as two sides of the same fundamental forces. And he said, do not force the power through the shield, redirect it. Use the crystal-owned structure against itself. Understood instantly, and together, they reshaped her magic, and instead of shattering the void crystal, imploded, collapsing into itself, and taking corruption with it in a cascade of destructive energy. The sanctuary shuddered and corrupt energy bled away like poison being drawn from a wound. And slowly, the young dragon chrysalises began glowing with clean, pure light again, their natural radiance restored. Victory, but at a cost, because Jake and collapsed against each other, completely exhausted from the magical effort. And the bond still thrummed between them, intensified by what they had just accomplished together. Through the bond Jake felt relief and pride, and something warmer that she did not try to hide anymore, because hiding was pointless when they were connected so intimately. She whispered that Jake had saved the next generation of dragons, the future of their alliance with. Jake corrected her, saying they had saved them together as partners. Looked up at him, and in that moment Jake realized defending Lyra might have started his involvement in this war, but something else entirely was keeping him here now, and that something had silver hair and violet eyes, and had lived 2,000 years waiting for someone who could stand beside her as an equal. Voice echoed through the sanctuary, bitter and mocking, saying how clever her sister was, and how the human pet continued to surprise her, and she told them to enjoy this victory, because it would be their last. Then enemy forces retreated again, and Jake knew with certainty that once again they had won the battle, but had learned more about their capabilities, and was planning something even more devastating. As they flew back to Jake and sat close together on, and neither spoke, but through the bond words were unnecessary, because they both felt what was growing between them. Lyra caught Jake's eye during the flight, and mouthed silently that she had warned him about catching her mother's attention. Jake had a feeling the war was going to be the simpler of his challenges going forward, because navigating a relationship with an immortal queen, while being a mortal human soldier, was complexity he had never trained for. But as hand found his and squeezed gently while they flew through alien skis, Jake decided some complications were worth facing. The return to was triumphant but hollow, because they had saved the Crystal Sanctuary and secured the future Dragon Alliance, but main army still marched forward, and through his bond with Jake could feel her deep worry, because something fundamental had shifted in the war dynamics, and her sister was planning a final devastating strike. Stood with Jake in the war room that night, the bond still active between them, and she said she could feel something building through the magical currents like a storm gathering, and was preparing something massive for her endgame. Jake studied the tactical maps, and said they needed to attack first, take the offensive instead of waiting to choose the time and place of final battle. General objected immediately, saying they did not have the numbers even with the Crystal Sanctuary saved, because forces still outnumbered them 3-1, and defensive strategy made more sense. Through the bond Jake felt frustration and fear, because she was out of conventional options, and terrified of failing her people after ruling them successfully for 2,000 years, and Jake squeezed her hand, gently offering silent support. He said slowly, what if numbers were not what mattered most? And he explained that drew power from the void through portals she had opened, and those portals channeled energy both ways, and if they could reverse one portal, they could send her power back into the void. The war room fell silent because the idea was audacious and borderline insane. Said carefully that the magical backlash from revering a void portal would be catastrophic, and anyone near it when it reversed would be consumed by the energies. Jake said not necessarily, if they had an anchor point someone from outside this reality, someone not connected to the void influence naturally, and he looked at her meaningfully, because they both knew he meant himself. Lyra gasped and said absolutely not because that was suicide. Jake countered it was tactical advantage, using the one variable, had not properly accounted for which was a human from another dimension. Said sharply that she would not sacrifice him. Jake replied she would not be sacrificing him because he was volunteering. The queen pulled him aside away from the others, and her hands gripped his shoulders and tears sparkled in her eyes, the first tears he had seen from her. And she said she had spent refusing to care about people, because caring meant pain when those she loved inevitably died or left, and then Jake appeared, and she made the mistake of hopping. Jake asked gently, hopping for what? Voice broke as she said hopping that perhaps fate had sent her someone who could stand beside her and understand her, and challenge her to be more than just stone and duty. And now Jake wanted to throw himself into the void for her people. Jake corrected her saying for their people, because in these few days the elves and dragons had become his to protect as well, and she had become important to him in ways he was still trying to understand. Kissed him, and it was fierce and desperate, filled with 2,000 years of loneliness crashing against days of impossible connection. And through the bond, their emotions tangled completely, her ancient grief meeting his mortal determination and growing love. When they pulled apart, both were breathing hard. Said she could not order him not to do this. Jake confirmed she could not because he had made his choice. She laughed through tears and called him infuriating and brave and stupid all at once, and then her expression hardened into royal determination, and she said if Jake was doing this, then she was anchoring the spell personally, because if he was going into the void, she was going with him. Jake started to argue but cut him off, saying she was the strongest mage available, and the ritual required someone who could channel enormous power, and the decision was final. Jake knew better than to argue with a queen. The plan came together rapidly, and they would strike at Central Fortress, a massive structure she had erected from void energy itself, and the main army would assault the walls, drawing enemy forces out, while Jake and Lyra led a small team to reach the central portal chamber and reverse the primary void gate. Everyone understood this was desperate, and many would not return. The night before the battle, Jake stood on his usual balcony looking at alien stars, and Lyra joined him, and she hugged him tightly and thanked him for saving her that first day in the Crystal Forest, and for saving their future at the sanctuary, and for giving her mother something Lyra never thought would have again. Jake asked what that was. Lyra said hope and maybe love if they both stopped being so tactically minded about everything and actually acknowledged what was between them. Jake laughed and said they would try. Arrived as Lyra left, granting them privacy, and she told Jake she had released the bonding ritual because he deserved privacy before the battle. Jake asked what if he wanted the bond back. She smiled and said then he would have to ask his queen very nicely. Jake turned serious and said he needed to promise him something, and if he did not make it out of that portal chamber, she had to take care of Earth and protect his world, because his people did not know about the void or magic or the threats that existed in this wider universe. Was quiet for a long moment, and then asked how she could care about another distant world when the man asking was the only one who had broken through her walls in centuries. Jake said because she was capable of protecting multiple worlds and had the power and wisdom and eternal life span to do it, and because he believed in her completely. Tears fell freely from eyes, and she called him an impossible, wonderful fool, and said yes, she promised, and now Jake had to promise her something in return. Jake said anything. Said survive and come back to her, and let her have more than just these few days with him. And she knew she would outlive him eventually, and knew the ending before it began. But she wanted those years or decades or whatever time his mortal life allowed, because the alternative was never having felt this connection at all. Jake kissed her under alien stars, and it felt like coming home to a place he never knew existed. The battle for Fortress was apocalyptic, with dragons clashing in skis, turned red from magical fire, and armies colliding like waves breaking against rocks, and Jake fought beside their coordination perfect through the re-established bond, and they carved a path through warriors toward the central tower. Waited in the portal chamber, beautiful and terrible, standing before a massive swirling vortex of pure void energy that pulsed with malevolent power. She said she knew they would come, both and her pet human, and this was perfect because now she could eliminate them both. Told her sister to surrender because this was over. Laughed and said it was just beginning, and did they really think they could reverse her portal, because she had planned for exactly this scenario, and the backlash would consume them both, and with them gone the world would fall to the void. Jake and exchanged glances, and through their bond understanding flashed instantly. Said quietly that was right, and they could not both survive the reversal. Jake said then one of them would not have to. Started to protest, but Jake said he was the anchor, the outsider from another reality, and she had to trust him. And when he told her to release the spell and run, she had to obey, and that was an order. Said he did not give her orders, but her voice broke. Jake said today he did, because he was the only one who could make this tactical call. And this was what soldiers did. They held the line so others could live. And he cupped her face and said she had promised to protect Earth, and she needed to keep that promise and remember him. Unleashed the void full power, and reality screamed as dark energy filled the chamber, trying to consume everything. Jake grabbed and channeled every ounce of his will and tactical focus and love for her into one singular purpose, which was to anchor the reversal spell. The portal inverted and void energy howled as it was forced back through itself, consuming fortress and army and the betrayer herself in a cascade of destructive power. Jake shouted for to run now. She screamed that she would not leave him. Jake said through the bond that she had to, because her people needed her, and he needed her to live. Through the bond she felt his absolute resolve, and also his love, pure and complete and total. Cried out in anguish, but she fled, dragging Lyra with her, as the portal collapsed inward with Jake at its center, serving as the final anchor point that sealed it forever. The void was gone and was destroyed. And Jake was gone as well. Stood in the ruins of the fortress with Lyra holding her as she screamed her grief to the sky, because the war was won and her people were saved. But she had lost the one person who made her feel alive after 2,000 years of existence. Lyra whispered for her mother to look. In the center of where the portal had been, something shimmered, and a figure materialized, stumbling and smoking, but impossibly alive. Jake collapsed into arms, barely conscious. He gasped that she could not give a queen orders, and he should have remembered that. Asked breathlessly how he survived. Jake explained weakly that she had held the bond even when she ran, and used it as a tether to pull him back from the void, and he smiled, saying he told her they made a good team. Laughed and cried simultaneously, holding him like she would never let go, and she said she loved him, and did he hear her, because she loved him completely. Jake whispered that he loved her too, before passing out from exhaustion. 3 months later celebrated lasting peace, because they were scattered without to lead them, and the alliance between elves and dragons was stronger than ever. Jake stood on the palace balcony wearing armor that combined his military technology with elven craftsmanship, and Lyra reviewed rebuilding reports beside him. She said the council wanted Jake to take a formal position as General of Strategic Operations. Jake said he preferred Commander because it was more hands-on. Lyra grinned and said her mother preferred the title Consort, but was too stubborn to propose it formally. Jake laughed and said to give time. Lyra said actually, the mages discovered something interesting while studying how Jake survived the void, and apparently his bond with was not as temporary as expected, but had become permanent and extended his considerably, possibly centuries. Jake's eyes widened, asking if knew. Lyra said of course she knew, and had been insufferably happy about it for weeks. As if summoned queen emerged onto the balcony, and she had changed too, still regal and powerful, but warmer now, more open and genuine in her expressions. She pointedly told Lyra that she had dragon riding lessons to teach. Lyra winked at Jake as she left, saying her mother should try not to be too obvious. Moved into Jake's arms naturally and comfortably, and said she had a question for Commander. Jake said to ask away. Said Jake had crashed onto her world by accident and saved her daughter and earned her trust and changed the course of their war and somehow became essential to both her kingdom and her heart, and was any of that part of his military training. Jake smiled and said no, that was all improvisation. Said good because she had centuries of plans for them, and she would hate for things to be too predictable. She kissed him as sparkled below and dragon soared overhead, and their people celebrated hard-won peace. Jake had crashed on an alien world and defended a princess, and caught a queen attention, and found a home he never knew he needed. Sometimes the best missions were the ones nobody planned.